Okay, I'm going to be talking about focusing primarily on the rumen, and then I'll also talk a bit about dry matter intake and also about phosphorus, just to give you a few things to think about when you go home. So a couple of things that we need to think about is how can we maximize the amount of beef that we turn off for every adult equivalent we run on the property. So regardless of whether animals are actually performing or not, they're taking up real estate out in the paddock. And we want to maximize the amount of beef that we're producing. And obviously there's lots of things that we do in other areas such as genetics and animal health. And our focus is going to be on nutrition. The other thing that we want to do is look at how can we maximize pasture intake. The more feed we get into each individual animal, the higher level of production we can achieve, but we've got to have an understanding of how the rumen works to be able to assist animals to eat more. And pasture is our cheapest resource, so if we've got the pasture there, we want to utilize it without completely denuding our pastures. Okay. So if we look in the inside of the rumen, it's slightly acidic. So the pH sits at around 6.5 to 7. It's a very moist environment, so a lot of water goes into the rumen. So water intake's important. A lot of water goes into the rumen to be able to process the feed. So the microbes that live in the rumen get exposed to the feed that the animal's eating. And different microbes in the rumen are specific to breaking down different types of feeds. So we need that feed to be turning over in the rumen to continually expose the microbes to the different types of feeds that are going in. It's an anaerobic environment, so we get fermentation happening in there, and if anyone's done a killer and they've accidentally cut into the rumen, you know that there's fermentation going on in there. There's also trillions and trillions of microbes, and I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of them as well. So the two things that drive microbial activity in the rumen, first of all, it's the rumen ammonia level. And rumen ammonia is driven by how much protein there is in the diet. And everybody's familiar with protein, and we all talk about feeding urea to our animals. When you feed urea to your animals, 100% of that is only available to the microbes. It's not utilized by the animal, so it doesn't actually make it to the animal. You're actually feeding those microbes in the gut. And that speeds up their activity. It sort of puts them onto turbocharge, and it allows them to process that feed more quickly. And the more feed they're processing, the more they go out and eat. And you've probably noticed that with your animals when you start feeding them. They're going out and grazing a bit harder and spending a bit more time out in the paddock. The other thing that influences their activity, because the microbes live within a certain pH range, particularly if they're fiber digesting bacteria, is that we've got to make sure that we keep the pH on an even keel, or we start wiping out some of those microbes. So we don't want to have rapid changes in the diet, because that can cause problems. Or animals that are hollowing out if they're coming into the yards, going to sale yards, and then we put them onto a supplement that can present with problems as well. So what do the microbes need? They don't live on fresh air and sunshine. They've got to have fiber. First and foremost, we have to have fiber. If we don't have enough fiber in the paddock, that's when we run into all sorts of animal health problems. We need to make sure there's enough protein in the diet. We said that ammonia drives microbial activity. We need to also make sure there's enough energy in the diet. So just having fiber isn't enough. We can't have poor quality pasture that might have been rain spoiled or frosted. That's not going to supply them with enough energy. And we also want to make sure that we've got minerals in there. For example, the saliva that's produced contains buffers, and one of those buffers are phosphates, which maintain the rumen pH. Okay. So the microbes need to have fiber in the diet, and it has to be of a reasonable length, because they chew on that fiber and they produce a lot of saliva. So in a day, an adult beast might turn over about 140 liters of saliva. It doesn't mean they have to produce that much, but there's a lot of saliva involved in buffering the pH of the rumen, because you're dealing with an animal that's got, a rumen that's about half the size of a 44-gallon drum. So we have to keep that pH buffered so that those microbes can actually survive in that environment. They convert fiber that an animal wouldn't be able to convert itself, so they convert it into a form of energy that the animal can actually absorb. And that energy is what we call volatile fatty acids. And when you come to a Nutrition Edge workshop, we go into a lot more detail about that. So it supplies about 60 to 80% of the animal's energy needs. So those microbes are important for being able to convert fiber to a form the animal can absorb. They are also, because they're multiplying in the rumen all the time and they keep getting flushed out with the feed from the rumen, they become the main source of protein for the animal. So 70%, up to 70% of an animal's protein comes from the bugs themselves. So they're the main supply of protein. So we need to make sure we can maintain their numbers. One of the biggest things we can do to reduce numbers of microbes in the rumen is by having animals off roughage for too long. So you can substantially lose numbers of microbes within a 24-hour period of animals being off fiber. So the length of time they spend in the yards is really, really critical. They also detoxify to some degree, so poisonous plants, tannins, oxalates and so on, and they produce all the B vitamins for the animal and vitamin C. Okay. And we get all these gases being produced. A bit like driving your car, you're going to get a bit of exhaust being produced, and our industry has been absolutely caned over the first two, carbon dioxide and methane. So there's some pretty smart people around who look at ways to try and reduce the production of methane, for example, by finding ways to get rid of those inefficient microbes in the gut. Okay. Yep, so those are our two greenhouse gases. We'll just keep going. Yep, again. So that's what the inside of the rumen looks like. Okay, and everybody focuses on those big fellows swimming through, so those are protozoa. Some of them are beneficial and some of them are parasitic. All they do is eat other bacteria and starch granules. The little fellows swimming around that you can't make out, they're sort of in a wave motion, those are your bacteria. And if you had a teaspoon of rumen fluid, you'd have billions of them in that teaspoon of fluid, so there's a lot in there. And what they do is they process all that fiber. So there's some good microbes in the gut and there's some bad microbes in the gut. Okay. So some of the undesirable ones are the high methane producers, or methanogens. Some species of protozoan bacteria, so there are some that are inefficient or they could cause problems for the animal's health. And then we've got things like Clostridia, which everybody's aware of. So not all of the microbes that live in the gut are beneficial to the animal. And then we use things like feed additives, so ionophores. You'd be familiar with rumen modifiers such as Rumensin and Bovatec. They've been around for years. They're used to take out some of those inefficient bacteria that live in the gut. But there's sometimes casualties of war. Some other bacteria that are beneficial can also get taken out, but overall those products provide a good benefit for the animal. And then we've got probiotics that tend to be more natural and work with the rumen environment. There's a whole raft of things people can utilize to try and modify that rumen environment. Yeah, then we have things that might cause some sort of gut disturbances. So rapid changes in diet. Because we've got different microbes in the gut that break down different types of feeds, when we transition from one diet to another, we have to do it slowly so that the microbial population can adjust to the change in the diet. Otherwise, we run into problems. And a classic one would be animals getting grain poisoning if they're brought onto grain too quickly. Insufficient fiber in the diet. So animals that are off feed for too long, you start losing the microbes in the gut, and it takes up to 3 to 4 weeks to build those numbers off. So if you're bringing animals into the yards and your conditions are dry and your animals are losing weight, the last thing you want to do is have them off roughage for a day, because that's going to set them back about 3 to 4 weeks before you can build those numbers up again. Having nutrient imbalances, so not having your protein energy balance right. feeding urea, but if you're phosphorus deficient, not having enough phosphorus in the diet. So we need to get all of our nutrients balanced in the diet. And our challenge is then to figure out, well, what's missing in the diet? Or oversupply of nutrients. Having enough roughage in there is number one, it's key, because it slows things down and the release of some of those nutrients. When people run out of grass, that's when all the problems start. And we don't want to run out of leaf material. All the quality is in the leaves of our plants, not in the stems. If they're on stems, they're on a Jenny Craig diet, which is also known as a starvation diet. We want to make sure there's enough leaf to last us through to the end of the dry season. Have slow transitions in the diet, and keep our protein energy in balance. Okay. So how do we increase dry matter intake? We said dry matter intake is pretty important. We want to make sure there's enough fiber, there's enough leaf material in the paddock. We want a diet that's quite digestible, easy for the microbes to break down because it can be passed through quickly. When we do things like feed urea, if the animals respond to urea, it doesn't improve the digestibility, but it improves the turnover so those animals can go in and eat more grass. And more grass means more protein, more energy for the animal. Having a nutrient balance and then adequate nitrogen and phosphorus is pretty key. So some of you might already be adequate for phosphorus, and we'll talk about that shortly. So speaking of phosphorus, there is some work done up in the territory, and it's just a bit of an example of the degree to which your animals might respond to a phosphorus supplement. In this particular case, the country was acutely phosphorus deficient, so you're not going to see this result everywhere, but just to give you an idea, you can have a big impact on birth weights, which will reduce neonatal losses, increase weaning rates, increase breeder condition score, so she's more likely to go into calf again, and also reduction in mortality rates as well. So, pretty significant gains in productivity when we do feed phosphorus if we do have a deficiency. And what this graph is showing is, so the unsupplemented animals is a solid line, and the broken line are animals that are supplemented. What it's saying is on the right, you can see there's not much difference, much of a gap between the two lines. So if your country's P adequate, there's nothing to be gained by feeding phosphorus. So we want to check our phosphorus status before we start feeding phosphorus. If we're acutely deficient, there's a lot to be gained, and as our country becomes more marginally deficient, the return is a little bit less. So everybody needs to do their own homework on that. Okay. Where is it used? Phosphorus is used in every metabolic process in the body. So calcium is most abundant. Phosphorus is most important. It's involved in protein, energy, carbohydrate metabolism. It's important for milk production, for fetal growth, for weight gain. So for every kilo of weight that an animal puts on over the wet season, they need 8 grams of phosphorus to produce that muscle. So it can limit production. Even if your animals are gaining, if your country's P deficient or your animals are P deficient, they could potentially be gaining a little bit more. And importantly, it really dramatically increases how much pasture animals will eat. So for example, if you've got animals that are on acutely deficient country, not feeding phosphorus will result in a depression of dry matter intake by up to 50%. So it's a dramatic depression on pasture intake. Conversely, if you start feeding it, just be aware that you've just effectively doubled your stocking rate. So we've got to adjust for that as well. Yeah. Running out of time? Okay, I'm just about done. So consequences of a P deficiency. So this was some work done by Simon Quigley, and it just showed that these are steers receiving different levels of phosphorus, and obviously the lines that are higher up in the graph are steers that received more phosphorus. So there's a dramatic difference in dry matter intake, and if we go to the next graph, that's translated into weight gain. So there's, in a 175-day trial, the steers that were receiving adequate phosphorus gained 130 kilograms more than the steers that were on a phosphorus deficient diet. Even though the protein energy levels in the diet were quite high, phosphorus was limiting their production. So just to summarize, and I know I've gone through a whole lot of things, so if you do have questions, come and have a chat with me. We need to make sure there's enough fiber in the diet, first and foremost. All problems start when we run out of grass. We need to have adequate protein and energy in the diet. It also keeps the rumen microbes functioning. And we need to have our nutrients balanced, because if our nutrients are out of balance, it causes a depression in pasture intake as well. Secondly, to maximize dry matter intake, again, we need maximum leaf in the paddock. So we need to go out and look at, what plants have the most leaf. Do we have enough leaf to get us through the dry season? It doesn't matter if your stem is this long at the end of the dry season. They're on a really poor quality diet and a starvation diet if they're being forced to eat stems. And we want to supply energy and protein as well where they're deficient in the diet, and make sure our nutrients are balanced. And finally, my own little piece of wisdom is whatever we do to our animals is going to have some sort of consequence, and is that positive or negative? Everything you do with your animals is going to have some sort of an impact on their productivity, and it might be subtle, but it does have an impact. And what we've got to think about is, what impact is that having, and what impact is that having on the rumen environment? Because those microbes they're the powerhouse of digestion in the animal. Thank you.